when the wheat fields in Kansas were set ablaze by the farmers themselves, when bright red cherries lay scattered on the ground in Washington with no one to pick them, when green vegetables in California wilted right in the middle of harvest season, people began to realize the United States was no longer the breadbasket of the world. Meanwhile, up north, Canada made no loud declarations. They simply delivered on time, signed long-term contracts, and quietly claimed the market share that America was leaving behind. What happened? Why is an agricultural superpower like the U.S. standing by as Canada replaces it on its own home turf? And how will this affect your meals, your wallet, and your future? Ashes on the wheat fields. The first story didn't begin with numbers, but with a smell. The acrid scent of burnt ash carried by the wind across the Kansas plains. One afternoon in June, a group of farmers stopped waiting for rain. They also stopped waiting for wheat contracts from the Middle East or Africa. They stood silently in the golden fields and lit fires that consumed the crops they had planted throughout spring. Not out of anger, but out of calculation. Burning the wheat fields was now cheaper than harvesting them. This was no longer an isolated act. It was a signal. The American agricultural model is cracking from within, right at what was once called the heartland of national food production. Kansas, a state that once contributed up to 20% of all U.S. wheat production, lacks neither land, nor machinery, nor tradition. But what people can no longer hold on to is the reason to sow. For years, farming households here relied on a steady chain of export contracts to Egypt, Nigeria, and the Philippines. These international agreements were the backbone that helped them survive droughts, high fuel costs, or soaring equipment maintenance bills. But since 2023, everything has quietly unraveled. Fertilizer prices rose by 38%, and agricultural insurance costs nearly doubled. Tax breaks, once a lifeline, were cut in the 2025 budget bill as part of an austerity policy. And even though expenses went up, farmers could still manage, if there was a guaranteed market. The problem is, the market disappeared too. A wave of export contracts was canceled or redirected. Long-standing buyers who once waited for American wheat have now signed with Canada. For a very simple reason, Canada delivers on time, uninterrupted by labor crises, tariff disputes, or domestic politics. Yet the biggest blow didn't come from abroad. It came from inside the United States. Since early 2025, following a wave of immigration crackdowns in Texas and California, seasonal labor across key agricultural states has collapsed. Over 40% of harvest workers in Kansas vanished in just a few months. No one to pick, no one to operate the combines, and no one with enough funds to rent automated equipment. Farmers were trapped in a painful choice: harvest and lose more money, or let it rot and lose everything. Faced with a dead end, they chose fire, to cut their losses and file for crop insurance. Across the border, Canada didn't need to burn anything, they just showed up on time. Saskatchewan, once dismissed for its cold climate and short growing season, is now signing 1.7 billion Canadian dollars in wheat contracts in 2024 alone. Not because their land is better, but because their approach is better. From new rail lines connecting farms directly to the Port of Vancouver to international standard cold storage facilities, Canada has quietly built a modern supply chain that meets the global market's demands: speed, stability, and political consistency. At Canadian agricultural universities, students don't just learn how to plant. They learn data analysis, drone operation, and yield forecasting through machine learning. Meanwhile, in Kansas, a survey in early 2025 found that only 11% of agriculture students intend to return to farming after graduation. Not for lack of passion, but because they've seen their parents worn down by harvest seasons that always end in losses, unpaid bills stacking up, and the bank's phone ringing more often than spring rain. The U.S. Department of Agriculture recently projected that wheat acreage would drop to 9.4 million acres, the lowest since 1970. Meanwhile, Saskatchewan is expanding by another 2.6%, with plans to boost processing capacity and target premium markets like Japan and South Korea. On paper, this is an economic story, but for Kansas farmers, it's a blow to the heart. The soil is still fertile. The machines are still there. But no one is coming to buy. No one left to work. No hope to hold on to. Only drifting smoke across the fields. If anyone ever believed that Americans would always be the ones feeding the world, today they must face a painful reality. The world is turning away. Not because America is weaker, but because Canada is more reliable. And from the blackened wheat fields of Kansas, the scariest thing isn't the failed harvest. It's the loss of purpose. The cherries no one picked. There were no alarm sirens, no official bans, and no raids took place. Yet, in just one night in early June 2025, hundreds of fruit pickers vanished from the cherry orchards in central Washington. They left behind nothing but half-used ladders, empty plastic bins, and a chilling silence in what was supposed to be the busiest season of the year. What drove them away wasn't an actual event, but a rumor. Ice was coming. From Wenatchee to Yakima, orchards once filled with laughter, and the sound of trucks now echoed only with wind rustling through branches heavy with ripe fruit. Cherries don't wait. A one-week delay means the entire season is lost. And this year, Washington, which once produced over 60% of the United States' total fresh cherry exports, didn't make it in time. The orchard owners, clad in sun-scorched protective gear, stood among glowing red trees, not knowing what to do but watch the cherries fall to the ground. They had prepared since March, transport contracts, spraying schedules, even export orders to Japan, South Korea, and Europe. Everything was ready, but the labor force, the most crucial link in the chain, had evaporated like morning mist. No cherry can fall neatly into an export crate on its own. This delicate fruit must be hand-picked, gently, at the right time, then placed into cold storage within less than 6 hours. A single day's delay means a returned container. One spoiled shipment means a lost customer forever. And this year, Washington didn't just lose a crop. They lost trust. In the packing plants, shifts were cut. Refrigerated trucks sat idle without drivers. Orders were canceled one after another. International buyers, who had no time to wait, turned to Plan B, Canada. And up north, British Columbia was ready. Without waiting for rumors, without waiting for a market in turmoil, farms in the Okanagan Valley had already signed most of their contracts back in February. This year, British Columbia reached a record-high cherry output of 5 million boxes, exported mainly to China, Japan, South Korea, Europe, and most recently, the United Arab Emirates. Refrigerated containers lined up at the port of Vancouver, not in search of buyers, but to fulfill orders signed in winter. While Washington scrambled for workers, Canada invested in logistics. Cold storage stations, individual cherry quality control systems, and premium export packaging standards had been standardized years ago. Each container included a temperature monitoring system connected directly to receiving warehouses in Osaka or Amsterdam. Every shipment was guaranteed to stay fresh for at least 15 days after transport, something increasingly difficult for the U.S. to ensure. And the cruelest part? No one waited for the U.S. to come back. In the second quarter of 2025, over $300 million in contracts, once belonging to Washington, were re-signed with Canadian partners. Not because Canada was cheaper, but because they could deliver on time, unaffected by labor disruptions or immigration policies. In Seattle supermarkets, Domestic cherry prices doubled, yet the shelves remained empty. People lined up just to buy a box of fruit, grown only a few hundred kilometers away, but left unpicked. A painfully ironic reality during peak harvest. The ripple effects spread wide. Restaurants in Spokane cut their menus. Rural gas stations lost customers. A small diner in Chelan closed after 17 years because its main clientele, farm workers, no longer came in for lunch. But the most haunting part was the silence. No one cried. No one slammed tables demanding rights. It was just a system quietly bleeding out, without bleeding. At a closed-door meeting of the British Columbia Cherry Association, many exporters shifted from seasonal to 3- to 5-year contracts, ensuring price, quantity, and schedule stability. This was no longer about market competition. This was a global redistribution of trust, and the U.S. stood outside of it. While Washington struggled to keep the season from collapsing, Canada quietly opened new doors to India, to the Middle East, places that once were America's markets. But now, those buyers are not turning back. Because in a world full of disruption, what partners seek is no longer low cost, but stability. And Washington, though the land is still good, the fruit still sweet, and the people still trying, can no longer offer that stability. This year, American cherries weren't banned, weren't boycotted. They just didn't make it to where they needed to go. And in international trade, that alone is enough to lose a role. Not because you're no longer skilled, but because you're no longer on time. When green fields become a burden. In California, people didn't burn fields like in Kansas, nor did they stand helplessly among fallen fruit like in Washington. Here, collapse wasn't loud. It passed silently like a drought. No smoke, no tears, no shouting. Just rows of green vegetables still thriving, yet left to wither under the 104-degree summer sun. And as they began to yellow and die at the root, farmers didn't complain. They quietly brought out the plows to bury everything into the soil, not to replant, but to erase a failure that had long been foreseen. Located in the heart of the Salinas Valley, once called the Green Heart of America, California used to supply over 40% of all fresh vegetables for the entire United States. Every leaf of lettuce, every carrot or broccoli floret you've seen in your meal likely started in this land. But in the summer of 2025, what was once a point of pride has now become a source of anxiety. Not because of crop failure, but because of the loss of labor, the loss of system, the loss of markets. This year, vegetable prices in Los Angeles at times hit $6 for a bunch of lettuce. Yet in Salinas, less than 300 kilometers away, thousands of hectares of vegetables were left unharvested. No workers to pick them, no purchase contracts, no refrigerated trucks arriving. Farm owners could do nothing more than let the crops dry and die, because harvesting them would cost more than double the sale price. Consumers didn't understand. They just saw expensive vegetables, hard to find, and switched to frozen goods or removed greens from their meals altogether. But behind the supermarket shelves lies a chain reaction of breakdown. A shortage of seasonal workers forced packing plants to reduce capacity. Without export contracts, refrigerated trucks sat idle. With no cash flow, farmers couldn't afford rent, water, or equipment. And everything began with policy. After southern states tightened labor and residency rules, thousands of migrant workers, the backbone of California's vegetable industry, simply left. No letters of resignation, no protests, no media headlines. They just disappeared. And left behind were fields with no one to tend them. Meanwhile, up north, Canada didn't wait for America to fail before stepping in. They had prepared long before. From Ontario to British Columbia, a series of cold storage centers had been upgraded. Temperature monitoring systems during transport were linked directly to warehouses in Tokyo, Singapore, and London. Every bunch of lettuce, every mini-carrot export package was packed to premium standards, traceable at every step, and arrived on time. In the second quarter of 2025, Canada exported over 3.84 billion Canadian dollars in fresh and processed vegetables, the highest figure in its history. Nearly 40% of the fresh produce orders from a major supermarket chain in the UK shifted from California to Ontario in just 3 months. The reason wasn't lower prices, it was less risk. Canada didn't need to advertise "Made in Canada." They just needed products to arrive on time, without contamination, without delays, without political baggage. Something California, despite better land and deeper experience, can no longer guarantee. Worse, when the system begins to collapse, even the smallest errors become disasters. A packing plant in Fresno recently had to recall a batch of vegetables due to suspected botulism, not from technical failure, but due to a shortage of final quality control staff. A school in suburban Los Angeles had to cut salad from student lunches because they couldn't afford fresh greens. And at an Asian restaurant in San Francisco, 30% of the menu was removed due to the lack of qualified produce. Americans are starting to see the label "Product of Canada" on their lettuce, celery, and spinach, right in their own fridges, and are left wondering, since when did California lose? The answer isn't in the soil, it's in trust. When a nation begins to lose the ability to secure its own food supply chain, it's no longer just an agricultural issue. It's a warning about governance, long-term strategy, and national credibility in global trade. No one banned U.S. exports. No one rejected American goods. They just stopped waiting. And the world, even if not saying it aloud, is quietly stepping away from the table once labeled California produce. In this quiet game, Canada didn't attack. They simply stepped up at the right time. And for the first time in modern agricultural trade history, a bunch of green vegetables from Ontario could replace the role of an entire Salinas field. Not because they're better, but because they're more timely and more trustworthy. When the smell of beef is no longer the scent of strength. Texas, the land of sun-scorched prairies, cowboys, and beef cattle, was once a symbol of American agricultural power. A quarter of the total U.S. cattle herd was once raised here. Texas beef was not just food. It was part of culture, a brand, a source of pride called U.S. beef, served from upscale restaurants in Tokyo to supermarket chains in Seoul. But in the summer of 2025, what remained on the parched fields wasn't herds of livestock, but ranch for sale signs, leaning in the hot wind, rusted and ignored. Cattle barns once filled with noise now echoed only with the howling wind. And in the midst of it all came a bitter admission. Texas's red meat industry was no longer leading the charge. It had run out of breath, not because there weren't enough cattle, not because of drought, but because there was nowhere left to sell. Since the beginning of the year, major export markets like Japan, South Korea, and Singapore have tightened traceability requirements, hormone regulations, and ESG certifications, new international standards that speak not just to quality, but to trust and ethics in the supply chain. And Texas, despite its long-standing tradition, strong cattle, and good beef, fell behind. As the world shifted toward tracking each cow from its mother's milk to the dinner plate, in many parts of the U.S., QR codes were still unfamiliar. A suspected E. coli case at a processing plant in North Texas pushed everything to the brink. Orders were put on hold, containers returned, and trust severely damaged. No one pinpointed blame, but the consequences were real. International buyers didn't wait for the U.S. to resolve the issue. They rerouted orders to Canada, where every cut of meat could be traced to a specific cow, a batch of grass, a vaccination record. In the first quarter and second quarter of 2025, Canadian beef exports rose nearly 19%, exceeding $1.2 billion, primarily from Alberta and Manitoba. Notably, many of those orders used to belong to Texas. Longtime partners like South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines have now turned to sign 3- to 5-year contracts with Canadian suppliers. Not because it's cheaper, but because Canada doesn't shift policies halfway, doesn't lack inspection labor, doesn't have plants shut down due to a shortage of supervisors. In Texas, the consequences extended beyond exports. When the market collapsed, the domestic value chain cracked too. Over 100 feedlots, once transfer hubs for hundreds of thousands of cattle before slaughter, have closed. Slaughterhouses operate minimally or go on indefinite break. Thousands of workers, from refrigerated truck drivers to sanitation crews, have lost their jobs. Towns around Amarillo and Leach, once dependent on the red meat industry, now feel drained. Job boards are empty. Local supermarkets no longer advertise Beef Friday specials. Restaurants are switching to frozen meat from Brazil. Cheaper, more stable. Beef prices in the U.S. haven't gone down. On the contrary, the price for 1 pound of beef in Dallas has increased over 30% compared to the same time last year. Not because of a cattle shortage, but because the supply chain no longer runs smoothly. As the export market closed, pressure shifted to the domestic market, but consumers couldn't absorb it all. The result? Rising inventories, shrinking herds, negative margins. The red meat dream, American steak, American burgers, is fading right in the kitchens of Americans. A steak slice is now smaller, thinner. Diners reduce portions. Fine dining restaurants switch to imported cuts. Even in cattle capitals like Houston, people are hesitant to order grilled beef because of high prices and inconsistent quality. Meanwhile, up north, Canada says little. They just upgrade plants, tighten inspections, and load more containers bound for Asia. Step by step, Canada fills in the gap America left behind. No grandstanding, no shouting about protecting farmers, they just act. And they act at the right moment. Texas didn't fail because it lacked resources. It failed because it lacked a strategy to adapt to a world that had changed its standards. When the global supply chain demands transparency, sustainability, and consistent policy, the image of the swaggering cowboy, free-roaming cattle, and massive slaughterhouses is no longer an advantage. It's a relic. And people will still talk about Texas, not as the heart of the red meat industry, but as a warning that, if you don't innovate, even an icon can be replaced, when a bountiful harvest becomes a burden. In Iowa, across fields stretching to the horizon, there were no flames like in Kansas, no fallen fruit like in Washington, no wilted vegetables like in California, and no deserted cattle barns like in Texas. Here, everything still functions. People still drive tractors out to the fields at 5 a.m. Corn still grows in neat rows, soybeans remain lush green, and collection stations continue to receive ton after ton of crops, just like every other year. But it is precisely this normalcy that is the most frightening, because in 2025, Iowa did everything right, and still failed. The entire state just recorded a record-breaking harvest. Over 2.6 billion bushels of corn, nearly 600 million bushels of soybeans. Figures never seen before in history. Harvesters ran at full capacity. Field containers were full by mid-August. Some farmers even had to rent containers and temporary warehouses in neighboring states because all the silos in-state were already full. But instead of celebrating, they stayed quiet. Because in their most successful season, no one came to buy. Soybean prices have dropped below production costs. Corn prices only barely break even. Numbers that in the past would have had international companies scrambling to place orders now remain just charts no one is looking at. Contracts from South Korea, China, the Philippines, markets that had long worked with Iowa, never came, because they had already signed with Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, places where crops are not only grown, but also stored, processed, and shipped under global standards. And Iowa? Still planting, still harvesting. But now, every truckload of corn returning to the station only adds to the farmer's worry. Where will I put all this? And when will I be able to sell it? They weren't wrong. They were just late. Not with the harvest, but with the world's shift. When international buyers demand sustainability certifications, carbon labeling, and environmental management standards, Iowa still only offers corn and soybeans. In areas like Fort Dodge or Cedar Rapids, something unprecedented is happening. Farmers are piling soybeans in garages, renting out-of-state warehouses to wait for next year. But wait for who? Wait for what? No one can say. This year's harvest is too good. And that's the tragedy. The more they produce, the greater the loss. But the deepest pain isn't in the fields. It's in the small communities, where agriculture isn't just a job, it's a way of life. In towns like Clarion, Winterset, or Marshalltown, evening restaurants are quiet because farmers no longer feel like going out. Gas stations are running at a loss due to fewer harvest trips, not from a lack of work, but because everyone is cutting every dollar. Schools in rural counties have begun offering mental health programs for parents, especially those grappling with farm loans but unable to sell their goods. No one is fleeing. No one is setting fires. But Iowa is collapsing. In silence. Meanwhile, in Manitoba, they're celebrating. Not because of higher yields, but because markets place their orders back in March. From pellet feed to cornmeal to processed soy, everything had a destination before the seeds had even sprouted. Cold trains roll out from the northern Canadian prairies straight to the port of Vancouver, and from there to the world. Not a single kernel of corn left in surplus. Not a single ton of soybeans abandoned. Canada understands. Production is only one part. Building a closed-loop, standardized and on-time value chain is what retains customers. And they acted. While America was still busy tweaking climate policy, debating fuel subsidies, or wrestling with input inflation. At an ethanol plant in Iowa, output dropped so low that operations had to be temporarily halted due to a lack of qualifying input, even though the surrounding fields were full of corn. It's a suffocating irony, a surplus of crops, but lacking the standards to use them. At the same time, a newly released environmental report showed nitrate levels in soil across many areas exceeding safety thresholds, raising fresh concerns for both domestic and international markets over food quality and safety. People in Des Moines open their fridges and see a soy sauce bottle labeled Made in Mexico, a can of soybeans marked Product of Ontario, and wonder, where did our beans go? That question is no longer about curiosity. It's a sign that Iowa's role, and America's, is gradually being replaced, one meal at a time. And on those still lush green fields of the Midwest, farmers still rise early, still operate the machines, still harvest with a discipline etched into their bones. But with each passing day, one question becomes increasingly clear. If no one needs what we produce, then what do we have left? A bountiful harvest, an uncertain future, and a fading faith, bushel by unsold bushel, when position no longer matches production. There was once something that seemed immutable for decades. The United States was the center of the global agricultural supply chain. It didn't just grow and export, it set the standards. From the post-World War II era, When the U.S. supplied wheat for Europe's reconstruction, to the golden age of the Midwest, the slogan, "Feed the World," never wavered. But by 2025, that is changing. Not through a declaration or dramatic collapse, but through unsigned contracts, unbooked containers, and countries once dependent now proactively looking elsewhere for more reliable partners. America lacks neither farmland nor yield. But in the post-pandemic world, where global supply chains demand transparency, reliability, and on-time delivery, sheer output is no longer an absolute advantage. The world no longer simply buys rice, corn, meat, vegetables. They buy the ability to deliver as promised. And on that board, the U.S. is retreating, leaving a gap that Canada, quiet and unassuming, is filling line by line. From Northern Europe to East Asia, importers have begun to pivot. In Japan, a major supermarket chain just announced a 60% reduction in fresh produce orders from the U.S., increasing sourcing from Ontario and British Columbia. In Egypt, a wheat contract once held by states like Kansas or Nebraska has now fully shifted to Saskatchewan. In India and the UAE, fast-growing markets, new clients no longer default to the U.S. as the starting point for negotiations. This didn't stem from a major event, but from a series of small compounding instabilities, from a container of Texas beef not delivered on time due to a plant closure, from a batch of Washington cherries left unexported due to a lack of pickers, from California lettuce that never reached Tokyo because of a shortage of standard-compliant cold storage. When a restaurant chain in Singapore drops the U.S. steak line from its menu, it's not because they no longer love American food. It's because they can't afford the risks, late shipments, short quantities, or sudden price changes due to new tax policies from Washington. So they sign with Alberta, where every batch of beef has a QR code traceable to the very ranch it came from. To global partners, Canada isn't stronger by volume, but it is stable, consistent, and doesn't politicize contracts. While the U.S. debates subsidies, climate bills, and immigration, Canada quietly builds its logistics chains, standardizes its protocols, and transforms agriculture into a predictable system. In the U.S., each state has its own policies. Each season brings a new crisis: labor shortages, water scarcity, insufficient cold storage, or simply a lack of trust from banks. But the world can't wait any longer. In trade, a delay of weeks can mean the loss of a customer for life. According to an internal report from Canada's Ministry of Agriculture, from early 2024 to mid-2025, over 65 long-term, 3- to 5-year contracts in the agri-food sector were renewed or expanded with clients who previously worked with the U.S. Of those, more than 40% came from markets once labeled U.S. priorities. This isn't just a shift in market share. It's a shift in status. Market share can be won back, but reputation, once lost, can't be recovered with advertising or short-term policy fixes. That's what makes farmers in Iowa, ranchers in Texas, and harvesters in California feel most helpless. Not because they're incapable, but because the entire system behind them no longer keeps its promises to the world. The average American hasn't fully felt it yet, but the signs are there. Prices are rising, but product diversity isn't. Product of Canada labels are increasingly seen at Costco, Walmart, even local farmers' markets. And when an agricultural powerhouse must import the very items that once symbolized its identity, that's when the question shifts from who grows more to who's more trustworthy. Canada doesn't need to claim the #1 spot. It just needs to fill the void America left, with consistency, standardization, and punctuality. And it is doing exactly that. Meanwhile, the United States, once the nation that shaped markets, must now look inward. In this new global race, is planting alone enough? Or must we learn to keep our promises to the world, one committed container at a time? When silence becomes the answer. No need for a breaking news alert. No need for bright red statistics flashing warnings. Just open your fridge, look at the canned beans from Ontario, the thin slice of beef labeled "Product of Alberta," or the tiny bunch of lettuce that costs twice as much, but no longer says "grown in California." The changes are happening, not with a bang, but with an absence. It's no longer a story about farmers. It's about every meal, every household, every consumer choice, every tiny trace of America's fading role in the global food chain. We don't notice decline when it begins, because the fall of a superpower doesn't come with an explosion. It comes with delays, with canceled contracts, with disappearing names from bid lists, with vanished dishes from menus, with swapped labels in supermarkets, and ultimately with the quiet acceptance that the world no longer needs America in the supply chain. From 2024 to mid-2025, according to ITC and WTO data, over $1.2 billion in agricultural contracts once held by the U.S. were redirected, primarily to Canada, Mexico, and parts of Europe. No country stood in front of the media and declared, "We no longer buy from America." But every contract said so, with stamps, with barcodes, with containers that sailed to other ports. And the concern isn't just about lost revenue. It's about losing the power to shape the game. When you're no longer the one the world asks, "Do you have stock?" but just the one informed, "We've signed with someone else." That's no longer just about agriculture. That's about influence, about stature, about the quiet geopolitical power that agriculture once grounded. Many still believe America's agricultural role is irreplaceable, that no one produces more efficiently, that U.S. logistics are unmatched. But the world doesn't need more efficient, it needs more stable. No one has time to follow Congress debating corn tariffs. No one wants to explain to customers why cherries didn't arrive in season. No one trusts a supplier whose answer is always, "We're waiting on federal policy guidance." Meanwhile, Canada doesn't complain. No loud stimulus packages. No headline-grabbing political speeches. But when the world looked back after the pandemic, after supply chain shocks, after climate disruptions, they saw Canada always showed up on time, always met standards, and most importantly, always stayed consistent. Even in the most demanding markets like Germany, France, Japan, UAE, where contracts require traceability down to the seed lot, carbon processing protocols, and farm labor conditions, Canada not only meets but exceeds expectations. Not because they're stronger, but because they understand. In today's world, what customers buy isn't just a product, but trust in the system behind it. In the U.S., each state is trying to put out fires with scattered efforts. Texas tweaking sanitation standards, California reinvesting in cold storage, Iowa urging students to return to farming. But all of it comes after buyers have left. No one returns to a supplier they once lost faith in. No one waits on a supply chain already proven unreliable. The cruelest irony is, American farmers are still doing everything right. They still plant, harvest, fertilize, fix their combines, but they no longer know who they're doing it for. Meanwhile, in Canada, they know exactly what market they're growing for, what day they're shipping, which client already placed a deposit before seeds even hit the soil. We used to call America the breadbasket of the world. That basket still exists, but no one's placing bread in it anymore. And when position no longer matches production, the loss isn't just money. It's role, it's influence, it's the respect that once came without question. The world didn't loudly turn its back on America. They just stopped calling. And in trade, that silence is the clearest declaration of all.